Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves stepping off a quiet, sun-bleached platform somewhere in early 20th century Queensland, where the heat clings to your sleeves and every timber sleeper under your feet feels like it's been soaking in sunlight since the dawn of time. You blink against the haze, and there, just beyond the station master's office, you spot a strip of surprising green. A little border of bottlebrush wattles trimmed in a way that suggests someone actually cared, and a drift of soft pink shrubs you can't yet name. A railway garden, humble but lovingly fussed over, sitting in the middle of an otherwise dusty nowhere. And as you wander closer, you sense the presence of the people who maintained these tiny miracles. The gardeners who coaxed color out of severe dryness, who negotiated with soil that behaved more like powdered brick, and who kept travelers company with blooms that whispered somebody thought about you before you arrived. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a big hat, 3 gallons of water, and the patience to accept that your boots will fill with red dust within minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the station's cast iron water tank, feeling the weight of the air settle on your shoulders. Everything hums faintly. The rails, the cicadas, even the paling boards of the platform as they creak under the slow expansion of heat. You don't meet the gardeners right away. They're out there somewhere, just beyond the curve of the rail line, kneeling in the dusty strip between the sleepers and the fence, tending to plants that look surprisingly alive for a place that survives on maybe 2 apologies worth of rainfall per year. A small signboard catches your eye. Moora Station Beautification, 1912. The letters are hand-painted in a tidy serif style, slightly faded but still proud. This was a thing, railway beautification, an idea that drifted out of British and continental European attitudes about civic order and into the sprawling Australian interior. The Queensland Railways Department encouraged stations to look pleasant, civilized, as they phrased it in their more formal memos, though the actual labor almost always fell on the gardeners and porters who took such pride in their little green realms. You step off the platform and into the narrow garden path, where the gravel gives a satisfying crunch underfoot. The scent is a surprise. Warm eucalyptus from a young tree, just tall enough to cast a patch of wavering shade, mixed with some faint sweet note from the shrubs. The mainstream historical fact here, something historians agree on even when they disagree on practically everything else, is that Queensland's early railway network depended heavily on small, community-run or staff-run gardens to keep stations welcoming and recognizable. They acted as both orientation markers and morale boosters in a landscape that could turn monotonous with alarming speed. But as soon as you start relaxing into this bit of clarity, you run into your first quirky tidbit. Some stations supposedly counted garden gnomes among their inventory. At least one railway inspector from the late 1800s mentioned them in his report, perplexed by these tiny ceramic intruders peering out from behind aloe plants like they were monitoring freight schedules. Historians still argue whether that was a sincere description or the inspector's attempt at humor. It's hard to tell with Victorian bureaucrats. Their jokes often read like someone trying to make a rock laugh. You wander further along the garden's edge, the shimmer of heat making everything look slightly animated. Your footsteps stir up a thin cloud of red dust that hangs in the air like watered-down paprika. A gardener finally emerges from behind a hedge of grevillea, wearing khaki trousers, a wide-eyed brimmed hat, and an expression that suggests he's been awake since before the sun decided to join him. He nods at you, the sort of nod that acknowledges your presence without confirming that you have any useful skills whatsoever. You feel judged, just a little, but kindly. He shows you the station's pride, a row of bottle-shaped clay pots buried halfway into the soil. At first you assume they're some kind of rustic decoration, but no. These are olas, a traditional method of slow-release irrigation that indigenous communities and early settlers alike used for centuries. Bury the pot, fill it with water, and let the moisture seep through to thirsty roots at its own pace. It's not the sort of thing you'll find in a flashy gardening magazine, unless that magazine is very specifically targeted at people who enjoy clay vessels and mild suspense. The gardener grins as he wipes his forehead with a rag that looks older than the station. Keeps the plants alive when the rain forgets us, he says. And given that the rain forgets Queensland's interior as often as you forget where you put your phone charger, the method makes sense. Your eyes catch an old wooden crate repurposed into a seedling tray. Inside it, dozens of tiny native shrubs are sprouting. Paper daisies, warrigal greens, and a few stunted saplings that the gardener admits he's been trying to raise for nearly a year. They like to test your character, he says. Plants around here don't just grow, they interview you. That counts as your first joke. Gentle and half-baked, just like the air around you. A curious detail emerges as you follow him past a row of ferns clinging bravely to life. Some railway gardens weren't just decorative, they doubled as demonstration plots. Gardeners sometimes experimented with new species to see how well they handled the heat, dryness, and the unexpected environmental hazard of bored travelers picking leaves while they waited for the 11:35 mixed train. It wasn't official research, but more of a practical, backyard science approach to understanding local ecology. Trial by sunshine, the gardener calls it, tapping a plant whose leaves droop like someone hearing bad news. Historians still argue whether these experiments influenced Queensland's agricultural development. Some say yes, that these gardeners helped identify hardy varieties that later spread to farms and nurseries. Others insist that's romanticizing things, that the gardeners were just trying to keep stuff alive without losing their minds. Either way, you can feel their quiet resilience baked into every square inch of earth around you. You crouch down beside a patch of soil where something small and green pokes up. The gardener explains that it's a native violet, a shade-loving species that technically has no business growing this close to a railway line. But he planted it anyway, in the shadow of a water barrel that drips just enough moisture to keep it content. Sometimes you grow things because they don't belong, he shrugs, gives the place personality. That's your second gentle joke for every 1,000 words. Just the right amount of humor to keep you from nodding off before the narrative intends. Beyond the violet patch sits a small bench, sun-faded and slightly warped. A Victorian traveler's diary once mentioned that many Queensland stations offered little waiting seats near the gardens, so passengers could smell something pleasant while dreading their next long, rattling journey. You sit for a moment, imagining the rumble of approaching trains, the metallic scent of steam, and the way smoke would hang briefly before dissolving into the blue. Someone, decades ago, cared enough to place that bench in this exact spot. Someone thought travelers deserved a restful pause, even if only for the duration of a departing whistle. Across the track, a pair of magpies hop in the shade, scrutinizing you like two suspicious librarians. They don't sing, they simply stare. You take the hint. You're being tolerated, not welcomed. Railway gardeners often worked alone or in small duos, and their daily routines involved dawn irrigation, midday shade tasks, and evening rounds to check for wilting stems. They adapted constantly. One week, the soil might behave. The next, a series of burning winds might undo every bit of moisture they'd coaxed into it. A mainstream fact, Queensland's early railways stretched across climates ranging from coastal humidity to near-desert dryness, and stations often looked drastically different because their gardeners were given wide autonomy. If one gardener loved roses and another preferred native shrubs, the entire landscape around a station could shift accordingly. You trail behind the gardener as he moves toward the back of the platform, where a rusted wheelbarrow leans against a shed. Inside the shed, you glimpse more clay pots, coils of twine, a watering can that must weigh as much as your entire weekend backpack, and, oddly, a framed botanical sketch pinned crookedly on the wall. It's of a plant labeled Melaleuca quinquenervia, broadleaf paperbark. My favorite, the gardener says, makes the place feel less lonely. You nod, even though you suspect the plant's real accomplishment is simply not dying in this heat. He hands you a set of pruning shears. You are instantly aware that you have no idea what to do with them. You pretend to examine a shrub, and he watches you with a slightly amused expression. You're overthinking it, he says. Plants don't file complaints. That's your third gentle joke. You're welcome, but beneath the humor lies something earnest. These gardeners treated their work as both service and self-expression. They were custodians of beauty in landscapes that often demanded practicality over aesthetics. Their gardens softened the edges of industrial expansion, offered comfort to weary travelers, and created a sense of place where otherwise there might have been only rails and dust. As you help, or at least pretend to help, the gardener mentions a rumor that some stations held informal competitions for best garden. Nothing official, just whispered comparisons between stations along a line. We didn't get medals, he says, but we remembered who had the best bottle brush. That competitive spirit will matter later, a thread weaving through the story as quietly as roots beneath the soil. You hear the distant hum of an approaching train, faint but growing. The gardener straightens up, brushing dirt from his hands. Passengers love seeing color, he tells you, even if they don't realize it. Makes the world feel a little less wide. And you get it. Out here, where the distances stretch like slow drifting dreams, a strip of green can be something like a promise that someone has shaped the land gently, that someone has tended to a corner of the world simply because it deserved tending. And so you keep walking through the garden's narrow paths, letting the warmth of the day lull you. Every plant, every clay pot, every stubborn sapling feels like an introduction, a hint of the stories waiting deeper along the trackside. The forgotten railway gardeners of early Queensland aren't forgotten here, not yet. In the rustle of leaves and the whistle of dry wind, their voices linger like faint footprints in soft dust. You step off the shaded bench, the sun pressing warmly against your shoulders as you follow the gardener along the narrow trackside strip. The ground crunches underfoot, dry and cracked like old clay, and you immediately notice the ingenuity baked into this harsh landscape. These gardeners didn't just plant flowers, they engineered survival. You watch as he kneels beside a row of low shrubs, carefully digging tiny hollows in the soil to catch the scarce water. A mainstream historical fact emerges naturally here. Early Queensland railway stations often lacked piped water, so gardeners had to improvise irrigation systems from barrels, rain tanks, and even discarded scrap metal. Without their constant attention, most plants would shrivel in a day. See this? He says, pointing to a half-buried clay pot, its neck peeking above the earth. It's an olla, an ancient slow-drip irrigation technique. Fill it with water, let the soil absorb moisture gradually, and voila! Plants survive longer in dry spells. The gardener smiles proudly, noting how effective even simple, old-school methods could be. Quirky tidbit number 1. Some gardeners supposedly use damp clods buried along plant rows as primitive wicks to draw water to thirsty roots. Historians still argue whether these worked consistently or were just hopeful experiments. You crouch beside a small sapling, noticing the careful layering of mulch and ash around its base. Mulch keeps the roots cool and pests away, he explains, tossing a handful of light powdery ash across the soil. It smells faintly of campfire and eucalyptus, strangely comforting. Nearby, flat stones form a tiny mosaic around another sapling. Heat pads, he calls them. They store warmth during the day and release it slowly at night, a subtle but effective method of regulating temperature. You imagine the labor involved, the hours spent bending over soil, arranging stones, adjusting shade cloths, and tending every sapling like a patient whisper. The heat is relentless, but the gardener moves with practiced ease, adjusting a hose here, propping a small screen there. Plants teach you patience, he says softly. You nod, realizing that the careful choreography of irrigation, shading, and mulching isn't just practical, it's almost meditative. He gestures toward a barrel of water with a makeshift funnel attached. Condensation collector, he says, pointing out how overnight moisture runs into the container for slow release. Another debate. Historians argue if these devices genuinely added measurable water or were mostly symbolic gestures. Either way, they show the gardener's resourcefulness. You notice small birds flitting among the shrubs, hesitant yet drawn to the greenery. The gardener chuckles. They unionized, won't touch the fruit without negotiations. That's your first gentle joke, softening the sun's intensity with humor. He wipes his brow, kneels, and checks a row of ferns struggling in full sun. They're dramatic, he notes. Some thrive, some sulk. You smile, imagining plants with personalities, as absurd as it sounds, yet entirely fitting for these devoted caretakers. As the afternoon stretches on, you realize that survival here is a quiet, ongoing experiment. Every watering can, every strategically placed stone, every tiny hollow dug into the soil is a testament to patience and observation. The heat, the wind, and the unforgiving red dust are constant challenges, yet the railway gardeners adapt with steady hands and inventive minds. And even amidst all this hard work, they find moments of quiet humor and satisfaction, small reminders that life, like the gardens, persists when tended carefully. You follow the gardener past the ferns and mulched patches, your shoes leaving faint impressions in the fine red dust. The air hums gently with the sound of distant cicadas, and the sun dips slightly, softening the harsh glare into a warmer, gentler glow. Here the story shifts from clever irrigation to the quiet purpose of the plants themselves. Every shrub, fern, and small tree is chosen not only for survival but also for subtle utility. You stoop to examine a cluster of wattles, their golden blooms surprisingly vibrant in the harsh light. The gardener explains that wattles and similar native shrubs were often planted to stabilize embankments, preventing erosion along the track. This is a mainstream historical fact. Queensland railway engineers increasingly relied on greenery to protect fragile earthworks, recognizing that plants could serve structural as well as aesthetic purposes. Quirky detail number 1. Some gardeners deliberately planted flowering species to distract insects from the platforms, reasoning that bees and butterflies would prefer a controlled patch of flowers rather than wandering into waiting rooms or luggage areas. You chuckle softly at the idea of a bee diplomacy strategy operating quietly beside the rails. Historians still argue whether these plantings genuinely reduced insect interference or were simply a pleasant coincidence noted in passing diaries and station reports. The gardener guides you to a small patch of herbs and low shrubs, explaining that certain species were chosen for their calming scents. Lavender, lemon-scented gum, and small flowering natives were deliberately positioned near benches where travelers waited for trains. The flowers do half the work of hospitality, he says. You inhale, noticing the delicate fragrance blending with the dust and sun-warmed wood. You feel the soothing effect immediately, a subtle nudge toward relaxation in a world that can otherwise be uncomfortable and relentless. Moving along, you spot a small, fenced-off area containing young saplings. The gardener crouches beside them, brushing soil gently with his hands. "These are experimental plants," he says. "I'm seeing which will thrive in full sun, which need shade, and which just sulk no matter what I do." You smile at his language. Even plants with personalities require careful observation. He points to one sapling whose leaves droop slightly. "That one's dramatic," he remarks, echoing a sentiment you've already begun to appreciate. Gardening here isn't just labor, it's storytelling. Each plant has its role, its personality, its place within the miniature ecosystem. A small trickle of water runs from a nearby clay pot, dripping methodically into the soil. You watch, mesmerized, as the slow release nurtures the roots beneath the surface. This simple technology demonstrates ingenuity born from necessity. Some gardeners even experimented with wicking cloths buried underground, channeling water to thirsty roots. The effectiveness of such techniques remains debated, but their presence reflects creativity in the face of adversity. That's your gentle humor moment, imagining socks or strips of wool as underground lifelines for plants. The gardener gestures toward a row of taller shrubs providing shade for smaller plants. "Shade plants protect more than just the soil," he says. "They shelter seedlings, calm the temperature, and even reduce wind stress." You pause to run a hand over the cool, shadowed soil, noting how much less the dust stirs under the shelter of greenery. In this quiet choreography of survival, every plant is assigned a function. Some stabilize embankments, others provide scent or color, and some simply endure, waiting for favorable weather to flourish. You wander to a section where tiny native flowers bloom amid stones arranged in patterns. These mosaics absorb heat slowly, releasing it overnight to moderate soil temperatures. Such practices reflect a subtle interplay between practicality and aesthetics. The gardener laughs softly, remarking that travelers often comment on the beauty without understanding the science beneath it. You smile, realizing that these railway gardens were not just functional, they were quietly performative, designed to soothe humans and strengthen plants in tandem. Finally, you observe the magpies hopping nearby, occasionally investigating the plantings. The gardener jokes that their union meetings require negotiation before they take even a single seed. That's your gentle humor for this section, lightening the atmosphere while underscoring the cohabitation of humans, animals, and flora along the tracks. You step back and take a deep breath, feeling the warmth, the scent, and the careful orchestration of life here. Every plant, every soil pocket, every drip of water is purposeful, yet collectively they create a sense of calm, a quiet rhythm that travelers and gardeners alike can follow. And as you continue down the trackside path, you sense that these little green corridors were more than decoration. They were living systems designed for resilience, comfort, and understated beauty. You leave the experimental saplings behind, following the gardener along the winding path that runs parallel to the tracks. The sun has shifted lower now, casting long, mellow shadows across the red soil and golden shrubs. Each station seems to breathe differently, its personality shaped by the gardener who tends it. Here, rivalry and pride quietly hum beneath the surface, as gardeners take care to make their stations just a little brighter, a little more welcoming than the last. You can almost imagine the subtle competitions. Who has the neatest row of bottle brush, whose ferns are the healthiest, who manage to coax blooms out of a stubborn patch of clay soil. Station pride is a serious business, even if it manifests only in tiny, meticulous gestures. A mainstream historical fact: Queensland railway gardeners were often evaluated informally by station masters and visiting inspectors, who would quietly compare the appearance of different stations along the line. There were rarely prizes, but the gardener's reputations depended on it. You watch as the gardener kneels to adjust a leaning sapling, brushing soil around its base with deliberate care. The competition isn't fierce in a loud sense. It's subtle, polite, and rooted in the satisfaction of doing the work well. Quirky detail number 1. Some stations reportedly kept shadow charts, notes scribbled by gardeners, recording which beds consistently impressed inspectors and which tended to wilt under scrutiny. You can picture a ledger full of minor grievances about sun exposure, misplaced rocks, and wayward seedlings. Historians still argue whether these charts were widespread or just isolated anecdotes, but they offer a whimsical glimpse into a hidden culture of garden rivalry along the tracks. You wander past a wooden fence lined with climbing vines, their leaves dancing lightly in the evening breeze. The gardener gestures toward a series of small benches and tables tucked into shaded corners. "This is the traveler's corner," he says. "We wanted people to feel a sense of calm while they waited." You take a seat for a moment, inhaling the subtle fragrance of wattles and eucalyptus, the gentle ASMR of rustling leaves, the distant hum of trains, and the soft chorus of birdsong wrap around you, like nature and human intention quietly conspiring to soothe. A small laugh escapes you when the gardener points out an unusual feature: a row of painted stones spelling out the station's initials. "Inspector liked symmetry," he says. "I gave him a little extra flourish." That's your gentle joke for this section, blending subtle humor with the understated pride of a gardener whose audience is mostly invisible. Moving on, you notice the subtle differences between stations. Some are dense with flowering shrubs, others sparse but carefully arranged. Every gardener has a style. Some favor vivid color contrasts, others prefer orderly rows of native shrubs. The choices reveal character. You see where gentle competition meets creativity. One gardener has a perfectly trimmed hedgerow, another an impressive collection of potted herbs, each claiming the small but meaningful victory of aesthetic appeal. Historians still argue whether station competition influenced wider horticultural trends in Queensland or remained a microcosm of personal pride. Regardless, the effect on travelers is clear. Each station offers a momentary oasis, a reprieve from the harshness of the outback and the hot monotony of the rails. You realize that these gardens were not only functional, they were tools of emotional architecture, shaping how people experienced the landscape, slowing time just enough to be noticed. The gardener shows you one last charming quirk: small labels beside unusual plants, giving their botanical name and sometimes a cheeky remark. "For the curious," he says. The labels read like little winks to passing travelers, acknowledging that someone cared enough to educate them, entertain them, and preserve the moment of quiet curiosity. As the sun continues its slow descent, you absorb the rhythm of station life. The gentle, unspoken rivalries, the care lavished on every petal and frond, the subtle signals of pride and creativity. The magpies still patrol the garden edges, unconcerned, as if to remind you that not all life here is bound by human intent. And as you stroll past the final stretch of vibrant flower beds, you feel the comforting sense of community, not just among gardeners, but across the stations themselves, connected by shared labor, pride, and a quiet love for improbable green spaces in an otherwise harsh land. The afternoon light softens into a mellow amber as you follow the gardener toward the edge of the station. Here the path narrows, and the green strips of life seem to merge gently into the harsher outback beyond. You sense the quiet melancholy that has begun to settle over this story. The era of railway gardeners is waning. Motorized maintenance crews are arriving, mechanized tools replacing tender hands. The careful, patient cultivation of each embankment, each patch of soil, is being superseded by speed, efficiency, and standardization. You trudge beside the gardener, noticing how his hands linger over familiar plants, brushing them with care as if saying goodbye. A mainstream historical fact: by the mid-20th century, many of Queensland's small railway gardens were abandoned or maintained minimally as rail transport became more mechanized and less personal. Gardeners who once held semi-official status became unofficial archivists of their own labor. preserving knowledge in faded journals, informal instructions, and memory. Yet in this slow-paced ritual of farewell, the essence of their work, the deliberate, mindful cultivation of beauty and comfort, remains tangible. Quirky detail number 1. Some of the last gardeners reportedly took seeds and cuttings with them when their stations closed, creating miniature secret gardens in their own yards. These hidden remnants sometimes survive today, unrecognized but thriving, little fragments of a lost craft. Historians still argue whether these practices influenced modern suburban landscaping or were merely private acts of nostalgia. Yet the notion resonates with the quiet endurance that characterizes this story. You watch the gardener kneel beside a final row of saplings, adjusting stones, brushing soil, and lightly watering. "It's all about legacy," he murmurs, almost to himself. "Even if no one sees, it matters that someone cared." The fragrance of eucalyptus and flowering wattles mingles with the dusty warmth, creating a sensory archive of human effort and natural beauty. You realize that this labor, quiet, patient, seemingly inconsequential, was deeply relational, connecting gardener to soil, soil to traveler, traveler to place. The last train whistles faintly in the distance, a reminder that life continues even as individual roles fade. You follow the gardener one final time through winding paths where native shrubs and ferns intermingle with sun-baked earth. Small innovations, the clay olas, the condensation traps, the carefully arranged mulch, remain visible, gentle markers of creativity and adaptation. You catch one last playful remark, a small stone inscribed with the initials of a gardener, and a cheeky commentary on the station inspector who once visited. It is humor, pride, and history folded into a single gesture, a reminder that even in fading roles, personality endures. As evening settles, you sense the quiet closure of an era. The gardener stands, surveying his work one last time, and the station seems to exhale with him. In the fading light, the tracks stretch endlessly, framed by resilient greenery and dusted earth. You walk slowly back along the platform, taking in the fragrant shadows, the patterned mosaics of stone and soil, and the lingering presence of hands that labored with patience and care. The stories of the railway gardeners are embedded in every curve of the path, every thoughtful planting, every subtle nod to both function and beauty. Their work may be largely replaced now, but their careful, gentle attention remains palpable. A quiet echo in the soil, a whisper in the leaves, a faint hum along the rails. The last of these gardeners carries memories that soil itself seems to remember, and you realize that the narrative isn't entirely about who survives, but about what persists when someone tends with patience, ingenuity, and a touch of humor. Now let your body sink gently into your seat, or perhaps your bed, as the warmth of the sun has long since faded from the Queensland platform. Imagine the dust settling slowly, the cicadas' hum softening into a distant, even lullaby-like buzz. The faint fragrance of wattles, eucalyptus, and wildflowers lingers in the air, mingling with the cool shadow beneath the last remaining shrubs. You feel the heat of the day melt into calm evening, and the carefully tended rows of plants, the mossy stones, the tiny irrigation pots, and the patient hands that shaped them all begin to blur into a single, serene memory.
The gardener's work, once vibrant and precise, now feels timeless. Even as mechanized maintenance replaces human care, the rhythm of planting, watering, and arranging leaves behind an invisible echo that whispers slowly through the landscape. You imagine the slow clink of water in clay olas, the soft brushing of soil, the gentle adjustments of shade cloths as evening shadows lengthen. Every act, every small choice, every careful arrangement speaks of patience, resilience, and quiet pride. And you feel it too, a gentle pulse in the air, a lull woven from human hands, dusty earth, and sunlit leaves. Picture yourself walking along that narrow path one last time, your fingers brushing the warm stones, inhaling the faint perfume of flowers, and listening to the distant whistle of a train fading into the horizon. The magpies hop nearby, indifferent yet somehow attentive, their presence a subtle punctuation in the long, calm sentences of this landscape. You sense the humor, the care, the tiny competitions, and small joys, the whispered stories of those who lived and labored here. And in this gentle slowing, your own breath matches the pace of the garden, deep and unhurried. Let the quiet persistence of these plants, the ingenuity of the gardeners, and the soft rhythm of the railway itself soothe your mind. Allow yourself to drift with the dust, the fading sun, and the lingering fragrance, letting each image settle like soft soil beneath your eyelids. The echoes of an era slowly passing remind you that even as time moves forward, the imprint of patience, creativity, and quiet humor can linger, shaping the spaces we inhabit, and in a way, shaping our dreams. Relax, and let yourself become part of this soft memory, where the heat, the plants, the magpies, and the gentle hands of the railway gardeners fold into a single, calming tapestry. You are here now, and the world slows with you, until all that remains is quiet, fragrant, and deeply, softly alive.